Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner. Recently, I appeared on the Adam and Dr. Drew show, and today I am thrilled to be joined on Crushing Doubt by Dr. Drew Pinsky, the famed medical doctor and addiction specialist who has hosted or co-hosted shows such as Loveline and Celebrity Rehab. He is also the author of several books, including 2 on addictions, and now one written with his daughter on talking about sex. Check out his website, drdrew.com, for all of his work. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below, and we'll get back to you personally. And finally, you can reserve your place in one of my seminars or purchase any of my mind-body guides, also known as the PDFs, at www.crushingdoubt.org. Dr. Drew, it is a pleasure to have you on the show. It was a pleasure to see you and Adam on the Adam and Dr. Drew show, but such an honor to have you on my show this time to talk about all kinds of things.
How's it going? How do you like doing podcasting?
I love it. Yeah. I absolutely love it. How about you? Is it something you've taken to very well?
It's becoming actually, I'm an early adopter, so I'm actually one of the sort of, I guess I have lots of experience doing this, but definitely we're into it. We love the digital platforms.
Yeah. How long have you been doing the podcast now?
It's got to be 10 years, something like that. Somewhere in that
you're
zone.
You're way ahead of me. Way ahead of me.
I can't even Adam just one day went, I'm having some success with this podcast thing. Maybe you want to join us. I'm like, what thing? What are you talking about?
Well, I give you credit. You roll with it. Some people, decide, no, I'm not going to go into the new thing. You roll, but that's what you're like. I'm not surprised.
No, that is my thing, is to sort of open the door and walk through and explore and see what's there and, try it on for size. And some things I've worked out, some things haven't. And that was that.
Right. So I have many things I would love to talk with you about, and I want you to jump in and go in any direction you want. Right. But the first place listen, I'm a therapist, so the first place I wanted to start is some of how you grew up. And I was thinking about the fact that your dad was a physician, your mom was a singer and an actress, and it feels to me like you have found some way to kind of combine the two.
It is a weird, it's a weird synthesis, and yet there was never any conscious awareness that was happening. I mean, every time I sat down in a therapist's office, they'd always go, "Oh, I see what's going on here." It's like, I'm not sure.
Not so sure.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a little on the nose, actually.
Exactly.
It's a little too just so. And I certainly went through lots of exploring to kind of get to the point where I wanted to do medicine because it wasn't my idea to begin with. It was sort of my dad's. And once I got there, I did it because I loved the science and I was into the biology. And then it seemed extraordinarily important and purposeful. So I just enjoyed doing it. And then everything else, sort of, it was, an incidental phenomenon. It was not as though there was a plan for anything else. It just sort of happened.
It seems like you're just kind of a natural explorer, but that makes me think about a little bit how I got to where I got. I mean, I similarly didn't know where I would go. I just explored and explored.
Yeah, I mean, people demand blueprints, I think maybe missing out on something.
So, I'm just interested in this idea of people as explorers and how we find our way. And I found my way to what I do through an actual chronic pain experience. I did not plan to treat chronic pain.
Interesting.
So I had 8 years of back pain, and I couldn't get any answers whatsoever. And it was eventually when I discovered the writings of this guy, Dr. Sarno, who somebody had tried to introduce to me through Howard Stern knew about him.
I was going to say, did Howard Stern introduce you to him? Because he's been singing his praises for 15 years.
I know. Well, the funny thing is I wasn't listening that much to Howard Stern. I have listened to him some, and I really love Howard, but I didn't really discover it until I finally got the book, and then I just was exploring. So I'm a therapist who really has ended up working with physical symptoms more than anything else. I mean, and to me, it's not one or the other. So right. First, I just wanted to hear from you about what you think about that idea.
Oh, well, I mean, I just did an hour with, what was the guy's name? He's now a famous neuroscientist who is discussing, that should be out in probably a week or so after this airs on the Dr. Drew podcast, embedding consciousness in the body and in the emotions. He sort of builds it up from first principles. He thinks that, feelings and the feelings that the body generates is the fact that we have sort of been in this duality since Descartes is a gigantic error, as Dr. Damasio says. Descartes' error was massive. We are thinking beings that are embedded in a body, and our brain systems are embedded in not just a somatic system, but also an autonomic system. And we don't even fully understand all the information that's coming in through that. And we got a long way to go to really understand what's coming in and going out. But I've been very involved in that field for a long time. A guy named Alan Shore wrote a book called Affect Regulation and the Origin of the Self. And he was sort of the grandfather of interpersonal neurobiology and how we affect each other and how we regulate our emotions and how we build regulatory systems. And he had a lot of observations about what he coined as somatoform dissociation, which is that, during development, part of the, regulation of affect includes regulating in what comes out of the body. And we now know a lot of that is located in the insular cortex. There's a very fine book by a guy named Bud Craig called How We Feel, or How Do You Feel, which is literally how we feel, which is this information coming up through the, I think he located a lot of it in the lateral spinal thalamic tract, but it's also autonomic and it's vagal. There's a lot of afferent information coming up that when I was in medical school, we didn't learn about. We only learned about what flowed out into the body, in terms of the autonomic system specifically. And it does all interconnect. It's a holistic system. It's a very integrated system. But there are homunculi, I think most people are aware, in the parietal region of the brain on both sides that represent the sensory system and the motor system. Well, it turns out we have homunculi all over the place in our brain. And one of the key regions where you can find if you cut through the insular cortex, you'll find many different kinds of homunculi that go from sort of vague to very discrete representations of the body and the viscera in the brain. And then that, of course, relays up to higher centers and reward systems and amygdala to adjust the salience of what the insular cortex is seeing. But these are, and we've known for a long time that when people get chronic pain, it's the insula that's off. It's not the parietal system firing of the specific somatic region of the back, in your case, that is firing off in the parietal cortex. It's actually the insular cortex that's going crazy. But in a way to think about that is we have the somatic portion of pain, and then we have the affective component of pain, or the misery component of pain. And many people have difficulty sorting those two things out. They see them all, they've experienced them all as the same thing, but they are very different and have very different sources and very different interventions in terms of making them better. I mean, if you smash your finger with a hammer, your insula and your parietal cortex are going to fire off. But parietal cortex is where you're really experiencing the pain, while the misery that goes on with chronic pain is primarily in the insular cortex. It doesn't make it any less real or less important. It's just a different component of pain. And it responds to emotional regulation. And so back to the somatoform dissociation that Alan Shore pointed out, he has all this data about early childhood trauma causing us to sort of disconnect from our body. So the body becomes a source of unregulated, disorganized information flowing up to the insula. And we don't, it's overwhelming constantly. It's pain, it's misery, it's scary. And it never gets properly regulated or even defined.
Well, you're hitting the nail on the head on so many things. I wanted to jump back to several things you said, but I'll stick with this one. Do you know the adverse childhood experiences study? Is that one that you're familiar? Okay, good. So that just, it blows my mind because it is definitive proof of what psychologists talk about.
What should blow your mind is it took until whatever that was, 1987, for my profession to go, oh, I guess childhood experiences do impact on what, and it only got their attention because it influenced so many other aspects of the medical health, not just the emotional health of the individual. And of course, they're all tied together, of course. And it was actually maybe in the 90s when it really got fully adopted. And I was like, what the
I think it was 98 or something.
Oh, was it really 98?
Yeah. Can you believe it?
That's so crazy to me. That's why I located in the 80s, because that seems crazy to me. But the fact that it was in the 90s is totally insane. But very few people know about the material that you and I are talking about right now, even though they know about ACE scores. They know what ACE scores in depression, ACE scores in addiction, and ACE scores in adverse medical outcomes. They really don't understand the dynamics that result in those outcomes.
Well, and I think one of the problems we run into, I'm very curious what you think about this, but I think we've got all of these silos of types of practitioners.
Yeah.
And they really stick in their silos.
Yes.
You know,
I must tell you, when I give a talk about this topic, first thing I put up is an image of the wise man and the elephant.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's an Indian proverb about the wise man and the elephant. One wise man says it's a long tube. The other one says it's a big floppy, kind of like an ear. And the other one says it's like a big toenail. And each of them sees one part of the elephant, and none of them sees the elephant. I've been contending with that for 3 decades.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that you brought up Descartes. I know the book that you were referring to about Descartes' error, but I've always thought, I'm not trying to malign anyone, but I think he happened to bring about this philosophy that caused such problems. And there's another philosophy out there that I think has become a problem, which is more of a philosophical movement. Well, I guess they both were, but postmodernism has. It has. Yes, I love it. I love that you hate it.
You should know. I was listening. I forget whose podcast I was listening to, but somebody. I think it was a very intellectual podcast, and he was interviewing a woman, academic French philosopher. She sounded like she was in her 30s or 40s, and all she kept going on about was, what is the matter with Americans that they're preoccupied with French philosophers from 75 years ago who we have completely sidelined as irrelevant, not useful, bad ideas. And you are just, it reminds me what happened. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me what happens to American psychiatry with psychoanalysts, where psychoanalysis just took over American psychiatry, and it was the only answer for everything all the time.
Yep.
And it became a problem because it was, they decided they had the answer to everything now, and they were wrong. And it was an interesting thing, an extra exploration, but was not what they thought it was. And it did a lot of harm.
And I just would add, I think you'll agree with this, but one of the reasons that these groups, whatever groups they are, take hold and kind of take over is actually they're right about something. But they're not right about everything.
Right, that's
and
right.
for me, that's where we can get our answers, is in science and logic. The system is designed to, if you're really being a scientist and you're really being logical, I say this all the time, you can't take an 80% correct theory. That's 80% correct. It might as well be 20% correct. It's like...
Well, it's not a theory yet at that point, right? It's just a hypothesis.
Right.
You got to prove it.
Yes, and one of the examples that I talk about very frequently is when they were trying to figure out the orbits of the planets. First, they had to figure out that the Earth was revolving around the sun, not the other way around.
Right.
And which shows you how off we can be. But I love that people think we're not off now. Now we've got the right idea.
I know.
And I'm like, what?
That's you. If you have the hubris to believe that, you didn't have good science training.
Right.
You know what I mean? Because one thing really good science training gives you is humility.
It does. It does. And sometimes people ask me, so let me tell you about when I work with pain, one of the ways that I get people better is with certainty. And the certainty doesn't come from me being a genius or me having all the answers. The certainty, I rest it on science and logic. That's the only thing that I can rely on. Yeah. It can't come from me. It has to come from the truth.
For sure. And to be fair, patients that are trying to regulate pain, they need a framework to move forward. And oftentimes they have to have the security of knowing, because oftentimes they were let down by people, right? So trust is an issue for people with chronic pain very often. So they need to know they can have something to rely on. And that is the frame of knowledge, the frame of science for their condition. I know when I was in therapy, I needed a lot of understanding to move forward. It just
absolutely
hard to put together.
Well, I think actually most people really share that. They don't often articulate it, but really, if it doesn't make sense to you, whoever you are out there,
it's hard to move forward. It's hard to give yourself over to the process because it's a very weird process. It's not cognitive.
No, and in fact,
there can be cognitive elements, but many times
right. I think sometimes people are asking for people to take a leap of faith and just go with it. And a lot of times people even do, but
Yeah.
one of my favorite lines from Sarno is, you don't need a leap of faith, you need a leap of understanding.
Yeah, good. Oh, so I didn't realize he had a framework like that. That's good.
Yeah,
I know he basically, was from the school. He didn't, by the way, know really what he was talking about. He was just talking, he just observed it and, and applied it, and that was that.
right, right.
And you and I kind of know what we think is the source of all this. But
We
yeah,
do. And you said another thing that was very key before, which is that we don't just have neurobiology, we have interactive neurobiology. Like,
right, interpersonal neurobiology, which is where I've spent a lot of my last 20 years, I'd say. So if people want to read about this, Alan Shore has some reprints out there, Peter Fonagy, Daniel Stern, Lou Cozzolino was part of that movement. There's just so many people now in it that I think it's being picked up and adopted. And so we don't, what you're talking about is, we don't just think about one skull anymore. We at least two or more is really where brains are not just embedded in their body, but they're embedded in the body, and then the body's embedded in a relationship. And the relationship is a third phenomenon. It's not you and me. It's you and me co-creating this other thing called the relationship.
Completely. Oh, you're speaking my language. This is great. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about. I mean, you're an addiction specialist in terms of some of your training, if I understood correctly.
Actually, very little of my training. When I got involved in addiction medicine, there was no training for it.
Oh, well, then it would be hard to be trained in it.
Yeah, I did it for many, many, many years in a psychiatric hospital. And after I'd been doing it for a while, a board certification popped up, and I took that and worked on, training from my perspective, which was, now there's all kinds of formal training for it, but back then there wasn't.
How do you think about addictions? What's the main?
I think so. You got to. All right. So people get all spun about whether addiction is a disease or is not a disease. So before you know something is or is not something, you have to know a definition of that something. Before you could say something is or is not a cat, you have to be able to describe a cat, right? And it's not okay to say, I just know it. No, we need some defining elements. And in the case of addiction, well, in the case of disease, just know, how do you define a disease? So you know if anything is a disease, it's essentially a complex relationship between the biology and genetics of the individual and the environment. So it's a gene-environment interaction that results in an abnormal state of physiology. We call that pathophysiology or abnormal biochemistry. That abnormal biological state is reflected in signs and symptoms. So people like me can come along and go, oh, this is X. I know by these signs and symptoms, that's what's going on biologically. Then I can prognosticate, because I know what the next term is, the natural history of that illness. So I know how those signs and symptoms are going to progress or remit or become chronic or kill the individual. Whatever it might do, the signs and symptoms will have a predictable pattern that's called a natural history. And then we try to do things with that natural history to make it better. We call that treatment. So it's gene-environment interaction, creating abnormal physiology, reflected in signs and symptoms, following a predictable pattern with a predictable response to treatment. That's it. That's all disease. That's everything. Now, the only thing, and of course, addiction fits perfectly under that. I've treated 10,000 addicts in my career. I can only think of 5 where I couldn't see a clear genetic link, right? So the gene's there, the environmental phenomenon. If you're sick enough with this disease to need to see me, the environmental piece is childhood trauma. So you have the gene plus childhood trauma, creates an abnormal physiology in the brain. It activates a dysregulation, right? The dysregulation is from the trauma. And if you're genetically set up a certain way, you will reach outside your body to try to help regulate. And you're set up to find things that are, you will like things like cannabis and opiates and benzodiazepines. You'll like them, and alcohol. You'll like them, and they will work. So initially, it's a strategy to build a regulatory system to deal with trauma, really. I mean, if you not in all cases, obviously, some people just sort of creep forward with the disease and all of a sudden they're out of control. But if you get bad addiction, bad enough you need to see me, it's childhood trauma that motivates your desire to use. Then the gene is activated, and now you have a second problem. So now you have trauma and addiction. And that's what we struggle with all of our 10,000 patients was, when do you time the treatment of the trauma? How do you treat the addiction? How do you regulate the emotions? How do you make recovery possible? because some of these people have chronic PTSD and other, God knows what kind of psychiatric problems that have been precipitated not just by the trauma, but also the years of drug use, which of course damages the brain or alters the brain.
Sure.
So and let me just say that the only viable argument other than addiction is a disease, which we know the genetics, we know everything. I mean, it's all there. But you could make an argument that it's a syndrome and not a disease. So a syndrome is many, many, many different diseases, many genetic elements, many different environmental causes, resulting in many different physiologies that give you the same signs and symptoms. So fibromyalgia is probably a lot of different things, but it manifests the same way. So that's a syndrome. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is a syndrome. It's caused by lots of different things: kidney disease, heart disease, coronary hardening of the arteries, large vessel vascular disease, renal left atrium discoordinations, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, many things coming together.
It's a syndrome. It's not a disease. But alcoholism is a disease. That just is. I mean, if you want to consider it a syndrome, okay. But there is many, we know the genetic sort of underpinnings. And we know the biological underpinnings. So there you go.
What I'm heartened about though is that you see trauma as such a central part of it.
Well, trauma, trauma is the inciting. Genes aren't destiny, right?
Right.
And just because you have a gene to lose control of a substance doesn't mean you're going to do that. Mm-hmm. But if you are reaching outside of your body to use something to regulate your emotions, there is where it starts. And the deal is it works. It works for them. They'll all tell you it worked. And then all of a sudden it didn't.
And then it didn't, exactly.
And yet they can't stop, even when it's not working anymore.
Well, and I wonder, how often do addictions come from chronic pain? We've got this opioid crisis.
A lot. I still see that when it's an addiction. We used to have we'd see a lot of that. We would see a lot of addiction and pain and trauma. I just look at it all as addiction and trauma. It's just all trauma.
Yeah. Well,
and if you can get people back in their body and into the interpersonal neurobiology and out of the opiates, which is what's amplifying the pain, magically everything gets a lot better.
I'm very curious what you'll think about this, but I mean, look, when you get hit by a truck, you have pain that's coming from a source that's very clear.
Yeah.
But when it comes to pain that's lingering, chronic pain, I don't even distinguish so much between the physical and the emotional. I just see it as one thing. I mean, we have to figure out how to untangle it.
But your patients would resist that diathesis, I think.
Well,
patients to go, but I'm in pain. They want you to know they're in pain, and I get it. So I don't try to parse those things out. My thing is like, look, I can make you better.
Yeah.
I can make you better. First, no more opiate.
And I really want to empathize with you and people who are in your kind of position. The people who come to see me, they've already read Sarno, generally speaking. Yeah. They're like, okay, I get it. Just give me the ins and outs. And so that makes me want to jump back to this thing where I love that you groaned about postmodernism, because I hate postmodernism. I think that anything that claims that there is no objective truth wrecks everything we stand on.
Right. There is no science.
There's no science.
There are no numbers. There's no nothing. And so let's go crawl in a hole. The fact is that, it's just ridiculous. It's so absurd. It's so absurd. And that's what the French point out. It's all absurd. It's ridiculous. And so why waste our time with that? Now, is there a multiverse, and is the Copenhagen synthesis of Einstein's theories or the Schrodinger theories appropriate? Yeah, we can speculate about the nature of reality, but one thing's for sure: whatever there is at least an emergent property about which we can make a lot of predictions, a lot. And biology is sort of the ultimate expression of that. And it's very probabilistic. It's like as I always say, it's like trying to predict the behavior of a cloud. It's hard, but it's not impossible, and it's not nothing. It's not real.
Yeah, and I personally find that it's so overestimated, and not just from postmodernism, but I think in general, people overestimate the degree to which things cannot be understood. I have much more hope for us than that.
Well, I remember when I was deep in my science training, I was extremely committed to the truth. Like I'm gonna figure it out, whatever it is. We can figure this out. It sort of was my attitude. Now, as I got deeper into clinical stuff, you realize how complicated things are, and you're like, oh, okay, maybe I'm not going to explain everything, but I can kind of understand things. And but yeah, I mean, and I don't know about you, but I listen to a lot of physics podcasts and things like that, and it's amazing what we're able to describe and explain. It's uncanny.
It is, and not only that, I mean, I know you'll agree with this, but the mind, the brain and the mind, whatever you're just however we distinguish that, it's hard to even imagine what this brain is capable of. And I love when people say, "Oh, you only use 10% of your brain," and I'm like, no. The brain uses all of itself.
Yeah. It may not be regulated or integrated properly, but it's all going all the time in all kinds of interesting ways, in ways we don't fully get, by the way. And we have no idea. I think all we have is functional MRIs, which are highly stylized view of what's actually going on. I mean, these are computer generated estimations of moments in time,
Yeah.
Who knows?
So I'm curious what you would think about all the imaging techniques that have come along, and how do we, because that's data, and it's useful data. I'm not saying it's not useful data, but
Agreed.
We have to understand what we're seeing. You can't just say, oh, there it is. So I have found it in my mind-body work, I'm often running into people who said, well, but people told me there's this, herniated disc or arthritis. And we started to study asymptomatic people, which actually, ironically, was in the mid-90s also that began. And at least to my knowledge, there probably was stuff before then. But as we studied asymptomatic people, we saw we don't necessarily know what it means, what we're seeing. We know what we're seeing, but we don't know what it means. I'm curious what you think it means.
You talking about brain imaging or back imaging?
I really both, but let's start with back and musculoskeletal.
Brain imaging, we see patterns and we try to associate those patterns with phenomenology of the brain. But whether or not that's causational or whether or not it's incidental, or the old notion from the 19th century that the amygdala is the source of fear, because when we knocked out the amygdala on cats, they stopped to be getting scared. It's like,
hold on.
Yeah, it's much more complicated, much. And so that whole notion of, and even embedding, and I'm intentionally using the word phenomenal, the phenomenological aspects of the brain, embedding it in the neuroscience is even something that is sort of challenging to do and difficult to do. And then, as you and I discussed, we're not just embedding it in the brain, we're embedding it in a body. So it gets really complicated in trying to understand what it's doing, the brain. And so we don't know. I thought we have some ideas, we have some patterns, and I find them useful. I find the most useful is when I'm wondering what the right theory is psychologically about something. And when there's a neurobiological correlate, I go, I bet that's the right theory. I bet that's the thing that's actually describing reality. So throughout my career, I have found neuroscience to be extremely helpful in terms of guiding my understanding of what I think to be going on.
That's fascinating, and I'm just thinking about. I think one of the reasons that we make lots of mistakes, and I don't blame anybody for this. It's hard to wade through all of this and understand what is happening, but I think sometimes we mistake cause and effect.
Absolutely, we 100%, just 100% all the time. Yeah, all the time.
And I think I'm very curious to know what you will say about the way that I work, because if I can get people through like pure science and logic, if I can get them to be certain that this pain is mind-body, it's a mind-body feedback loop, and it can be stopped with the right understanding, then it does stop. But it has to be certainty. And I'm curious what you would say about that. How would you understand
what that is? That's really interesting. I've not thought about certitude. I have thought an awful lot about safety and trust and those kinds of things. And those seem to be the necessary elements to building what you're talking about. And I'm wondering if certitude is sort of a stand-in for other things. You know what I mean? Like it's part of something that maybe has more parts to it than just certainty itself.
It could be.
Or,
I mean, yeah,
or
go ahead.
maybe you're seeing a population that's different than what I normally see that responds to certainty. You know what I mean?
Right. I mean, it could be that there's a particular part of the population that needs that.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I came to this because of my own elements of things. In growing up, I actually had lots of doubts. I mean, my show is called Crushing Doubt. It's, in a way, it's hilarious that I have a show called Crushing Doubt because I had so many doubts. And part of the reason why is that I'm, historically very empathic. I can take the other perspective, but I can take it so much that I can't come to rest and that's why I love objective truth. That's why I love, or the idea of Occam's razor, that the more assumptions you make in a theory, the less likely it is to be true.
Yeah, I love the theory of parsimony. That's the best. I use it all the time. But did you come from a chaotic background, chaotic childhood?
I did.
Okay. The kids, as you know well, that come out of that are focusing their locus of control out there. They got to focus out there to have the adults all glued together so they don't get hurt or so they get their needs met, whatever it might be. And there is kind of I don't know what, this is another phenomenal aspect of brain function that I don't know. I don't mean phenomenal by great. I mean phenomenological.
Yeah.
Which is, there seems to be, and this, I'm going to make a gigantic overgeneralization here.
Yes,
but in general sweeping sort of manifestations, there's people that experience themselves out there and then in here, and people experience themselves in here, and I'm pointing at my body, and then out there. And addicts are all turned in. Codependents are all turned out. So that's one of their fittedness. And I'm the same way. I'm out there. I had to control a crazy mom and stuff like that. And then also didn't get my needs met, right? So I was would go up the ACE score. So my ability to regulate was impaired before I had therapy, and I would focus all my stuff out there, out in the world.
Well, let me ask you this then. In terms of people's experience with therapy, it's obviously extremely varied, and the kind of therapy that's out there is extremely varied too.
Exactly.
But what do you think it is that leads to change? And do you think that change can happen quickly? Because I think that's something that is debated widely in therapy circles.
Yeah. I mean, it depends what kind of change we're talking about, right?
Yes.
There are quick changes. There are things that can happen quickly. And that's sort of the domain of cognitive behavioral therapies. I mean, people can have sudden understandings, they can have sudden certitude about something. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that the hard part is deciding, what things are amenable to that and what things are going to respond to that, which is kind of hard. A lot of stuff responds to it at least a little bit. But in terms of fundamental changes in the capacity to regulate emotions and experience the self and other and function in an intersubjective context, that takes time. That's a rewiring sort of exercise. And that takes a long time, a lot of work, and a lot of skill on behalf of the therapist to sort of know where to push and when to push, and what the issues are that they're trying to roll somebody through.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head about something a while back when you were saying that trust is one of the key variables in it. In the work that I do, one of the reasons that people do trust me is I tell them, look, if something I say doesn't make sense, push back against it. I want to hear that. I don't.
But you promise certitude too, which is interesting. That's an easy thing to trust, right? Certainty. I can trust that.
Well, it is and it isn't. It is and it isn't, because I think sometimes I say to people, like, I can help you be certain, and they're like, how? There's no way.
Yeah.
In some ways it makes them think, what are you, like a cult leader or something?
Right. And that's in there is that magic stuff of therapy, which is, how do we get people, it really isn't, it's not, people get very confused with what therapy is. It's not an intellectual process. It's not an advice giving process. It's a emotional process where you accept certain things and you experience certain things. And those experiences cause tectonic shifts in what's going on in your brain body. And, some of those things can be quick. Some of them take forever.
One of the things that I would like to add to the national and international discussion, all of this though, is I think we have to be careful about assumptions in both directions,
Okay.
because we sometimes assume we can't do certain things when maybe we can.
Mm-hmm.
In the work that I do these 4-session consultations, and in it, I usually, it's not always the case, but I do frequently get people to understand who they are at their core because of the method that I have in a way that I didn't get it in 20 years of therapy. I did not get that core understanding until I listened to my body.
How you do that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, the first thing is to listen to the signals of the body. It's like you're listening to a communication between you and yourself, and instead of depending on someone from the outside to put it together to you in some intellectual way, it's elemental.
I don't know about you though, but for me, I had a certain amount of like alexithymia. I couldn't. Feelings were vague. I couldn't identify them. I couldn't really talk about them. They were out in the distance somewhere.
Oh, definitely.
And it took a lot of coaxing to get them, connected.
I think that's true, but part of what I think is if someone had taught me to trust my body more, I would have gotten there faster. I didn't know.
Probably. Could be.
I didn't know. So let's shift gears for a sec, because I want to hear about your work. Your work of late. You have your website, drdrew.com.
Yeah.
And what are you working on these days?
Just a lot of odds and ends. I have a long history of going into environments where I don't belong.
I love
Loveline
it.
was an example of that, or what else? I've done a lot of things like that. What I did on Jersey Shore the other week was an example of that, and find a way to make it worthwhile and do something good as a result. So at your mom's house is Tom Segura and his wife's podcast platform. I have a podcast called Dr. Drew After Dark, which is sort of a newer incarnation of Loveline that is pretty crazy. Mm-hmm. Adam and I do a podcast 3 days a week, and you've been on that podcast. We just sort of chat. I do a podcast regularly where I interview people like you on a regular basis, and then I do a streaming show 3 to 5 days a week out of this studio that you're seeing in the background here. It's all sort of
beautiful,
but you can't really see everything because this is a computer camera. That show was really designed. I felt like the French underground when I was doing it. I started it last spring just to help people struggle with the information. Speaking of post-structuralism, struggle with trying to figure out what's true and what's not about COVID. And just bringing guests in here who have opinions and ideas and seeing what's going on and trying to make sense of the data as it poured in, and it morphed from that now to being kind of a platform where I'm interested in talking to people who have been deplatformed from either side, whatever extreme, wherever they come from, when they have nowhere else to go. Like to me, the poster child for this is Naomi Wolf, right? Naomi Wolf was a very liberal feminist who, from her point of view, has become sort of incensed with all the limitations on freedoms, but has never changed her liberal attitude. Now she's labeled as a right-wing extremist, and she's been deplatformed completely. And she's a brilliant one with a lot to offer. And so I bring Naomi in here. Let's let her talk. Why would you not want to hear somebody that might have some useful information?
Right. And I wish that we could deplatform everybody.
That's a good idea.
Well, and obviously very difficult to do, but I think one way to move towards that is to have everybody on all sides agree that science and logic and truth are what we're actually all after. Hopefully,
but they don't. Most people don't know what that even means. I'm sorry, but that's
no. Go ahead. Let's have it.
I'm not leaving my profession out of that sort of group where people have just not been getting good science training. They just have not.
Well, there's that, but there's also the fact that I think people are not very good at recognizing even the possibility of their own bias or their own set idea.
Correct. So cognitive bias is just blown up everywhere. And the Dunning-Kruger effect is alive and well wherever I look. Would your listeners know what Dunning-Kruger is?
It would be great if you could explain it.
Dunning-Kruger were two psychologists that it's essentially they made an observation about people who sort of don't know enough to know what they don't know. When you're learning a new topic, you go from awakening to enthusiasm to I know everything about this topic as soon as you're exposed. And then that goes to I know nothing. And then you slowly pull out of that into essentially the imposter effect later. Later, you know everything there should know, but you still feel like you're an imposter. So you go, I understand this completely. I'm an expert. Holy shit, I know nothing. And then slowly you develop true expertise. And that's when you start to feel like an imposter.
You just, I feel, you know what's funny? I feel like you most just described my experience as a guitar player.
Right. Well, music is a really classical sort of example of this. And I would point you no further than to American Idol. People are like, how do they get up there and sing like hell like that and think they sounded great? That's Dunning-Kruger. You just don't perceive what you don't perceive. And Dunning-Kruger is everywhere now. Everyone thinks they know everything about everything. And the reality is far, far, far different.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, because of the assail on truth, that the truth itself has been under attack. People don't trust experts. They don't know what experts are. They don't understand how they work. They don't understand how to use the information from expertise. It's some of it might be the internet, because they've gotten lost in information and data and not really understanding knowledge and wisdom.
I'm curious if you'll agree with this. I also think that the internet is playing into a psychological problem, which is many psychological problems, but I'm talking about one in specific, which is everybody likes to feel like they know things. And,
Yes.
like I think about a conspiracy theorist. The thing that they really are after isn't even the knowledge. It's just, I know better than everybody else.
Is it better than everyone else, or just I can make sense of my world to my satisfaction?
I think it's both personally, but
it's sort of a weird
debatable.
locus of control thing. I don't know. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I think you're right about that, and I think that your viewpoint on it is a rosier one than I was choosing, which is funny because I'm usually pretty much of an optimist. But I do think that to get to truth, I think we all need to take a step back and say, I don't know everything. I can say that I know a lot if I have taken a lot of time with it.
Yeah, I think half hour ago I said humility is a key ingredient in good science training. I mean, Einstein felt dumb, in the face of the universe. That's good.
And not only that, but his math teachers thought he was dumb. So
right. Yeah.
I also there's another thing that I was thinking that you and I have a lot in common about. I'm seeing. And one was that you like to wade into areas that are not kind of like normally your areas. But another thing that I think that you have done very successfully throughout your career, from my vantage point anyway, is to not be afraid to just explore topics in ways that challenge certain assumptions. So I'm actually thinking about the book that you, is it just coming out, or is it already been released?
Out in the fall, like September-ish. I wrote it with my daughter.
Right. You rewrote it with your daughter, Paulina, right?
Yeah.
It's called It Doesn't Have to Be Awkward, which talks about sex.
It really was a book to talk about consent. At the time we sat down to write it, young people were, the Me Too thing was in full swing, and young people were extremely anxious and confused about consent. So that was the conceit, consent. And then we used consent. We found that we could get deeper into the topic by using consent as sort of a springboard for just good relationships generally. And so we tried to, talk about essentially confusing and difficult relationships through development.
I wonder, talking about this with your daughter, I have two daughters, and I have found, strangely, nothing has made me more comfortable with the idea of sex than having daughters. You'd think it might be the other way around, but in some ways, I just find it feels so natural. Whereas I grew up in a family of all boys, and these women were like these other beings.
Yes. There's a mystery that you might think if you're around all boys.
Yeah. So
I've heard women report the same thing if they have all sisters.
Absolutely. So how did you and Paulina come together on this idea?
She's a Columbia trained nonfiction creative writer. And she's a super intense feminist, and she's very interested in being an ally and in the idea of consent and the Me Too thing. And so I just immediately, when they started talking about it, I thought, my daughter should be in on this. For sure, this should be her thing. I'm happy to, sprinkle in what I know and, try to guide this, but this is really, and she's, by the way, closer to the generation we want to speak to. We designed this thing sort of for 15-year-olds, and to have a 60-something-year-old doing that doesn't really work.
That's tricky. That's tough.
It doesn't really work. It just becomes lecturing. And she put in a bunch of stories and a bunch of really interesting stuff. And it's a very entertaining book to read now. And so I know I feel good about it. We created some interesting sort of constructs. Like she had a preoccupation with Elvis Presley when she was growing up, and she had a TCB necklace and she had a TCB tattoo, and which is taking care of business. This was Elvis's sort of acronym or something. And we turned TCB into trust, compassion, and boundaries as a model for thinking about relationships and consent. And when are you getting consent for real? I mean, have you been coercive? Have you, did the boundaries get violated when you asked for consent? Were you compassionate with the other person and with yourself? Could you be trusted in that environment? Was the other person trusted? So it became this construct that we then used in many different settings.
It just seems to me, though, one of the strengths that you bring to the table that would have been able to make that happen is, first of all, you are after the truth and talking.
Yeah.
But also you are so inclusive and respectful of other ideas.
I have no problem with whatever. I mean, being an ally, good. I'll be an ally. I'm fine with whatever. I want people to thrive, whatever that means for them. And now I know the problem is that because of the way our brain's constructed, sometimes people are destroying themselves and are defensive about it and think they're thriving when they're really destroying themselves. That's when you and I kind of need to step in a little bit.
Right. Yeah, I think a lot of the problems we run into are people thinking that they're fine or thinking and just not seeing it.
It's particularly with serious mental illness, the term anosognosia I have found to be applicable in many more settings than I had thought when I first trained. And so anosognosia is a neurological term coined by a guy named Pinsky. And Pinsky was famous for probably the most famous reflex a medical student learns about in medical school. The very first one from the neurological team is always the Pinsky sign, which is you scratch the bottom of the foot and the toe goes up if there's a problem in the upper motor neurons. And Pinsky coined the term anosognosia to describe stroke patients, people that had a right middle cerebral artery stroke that cuts out the left side of their body. They not only lose the motor and sensory function on the left side of their body, they lose leftness entirely. So when you have them draw a clock, they'll put all the numbers on the right side. If you show them the left arm that's flaccid, they will go, isn't that interesting? Boom. Must be somebody else's hand. The left of everything is left out, for lack of a better word. And so that lack of insight is something that we see in all serious mental illness. So schizophrenics think the delusions are real. They think their hallucinations are real. Drug addicts think it's a good idea to keep shooting heroin. Bipolar patients think that they are, have been tapped by the FBI and the CIA to go save the country, whatever the delusion might be. When you get to serious mental illness, there's always anosognosia. And unfortunately, this country, and particularly the state of California, has privileged anosognosia in the law. So you can't treat anybody with anosognosia unless they beg for it. And thus we have homelessness.
Yeah.
Because they all have anosognosia on the streets.
Well, I was actually just going to bring that up because I know that's one of the causes that you have spent time thinking through. And I love that you recognize it's through the lens of mental health. But the other thing that I was thinking about as you were saying it is we are then relying on people who have the problem to be the ones to decide that they have a problem. And
right. And when we're dealing with drug addicts, I mean, what's the first thing we tell them? Don't do anything that comes out of your brain, because your brain is under the influence of this disease. So everything that comes out of your brain will result in moving you back towards using. That's the way your brain is constructed. Until we can get this fully regulated under control, which takes about a year, just don't make any decisions without talking to your doctor, your recovery team, your sponsor, and let them help you make those decisions. It's uncanny, the bad decisions that drug addicts make inadvertently,
Right.
in the name of I just needed to close up that apartment in San Francisco. I mean, I got to get the furniture out of there. Oh
Right.
yeah, that's right. My dealer was next door. Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
right. Right.
Yeah.
And they're missing, and it makes sense. We all miss things. But one of the things I've gotten quite focused on in recent years is the concept, as I call it, of being in trauma. And the way I think about that, and I'm very curious to hear what you think about it, but if somebody has their trauma activated,
Yeah.
they're in a completely different mindset.
Right.
And on top of it, they're in a totally different physiology.
Yeah. And sometimes, when I've had these very strange experiences when I'm in the therapist seat, not the patient, but the provider. And I will tune in, something will occur to me because of the bodily based attunement I have with the patient. And I will say something of, like, I'm having a pain back here. I'm wondering if that pain has meaning to you. And they will leap into a description of a moment when their father kicked them, or they used to be beaten there, or something that had profound meaning for them. And they actually even oftentimes will sort of, to me, adopt a developmental state. Like they almost look 8 years or sound 8 years old to me, or look 8 years old, which is when that happened. And what they never do, they never go, how did you know? They always just drop into it.
Yeah.
And because they're just in it. They're
in
just in that state. And it's not, how did you know? Because I'm in it. Of course you know, because I'm in it. And
Right.
you're there with me, and we're in it. And to some extent, they're kind of right. But they never go, oh my God, how did you know that? Never, not once. Has anybody said that to me? Except
No.
later.
Right, later. Exactly.
Yeah, later yeah.
And I think some of that, see, this is part of the reason I think that therapy can go faster. I was shocked. I was shocked by this. I had over 20 years of therapy, but what I found out is that very little of it was what I would call trauma-informed therapy.
Oh, yeah.
It wasn't factoring, and to me, that's shunting aside physiology and biology.
Yeah.
It's just saying, oh no, it's your experience leads to these beliefs. You cannot think right when you're in trauma.
That's right. And I see, I don't know if you follow Bessel van der Kolk and these guys.
I do. Yep.
Really
Body keeps the score. Yep.
Yeah. These and Peter Levine and those guys that Waking the Tiger, and they've been on this for a while, and they got it. They figured it out. And for some reason, I don't know why, the world doesn't pick up on it. It's like so obvious when you arrive there that, here we go. This is how it works.
But let's see if we can tackle this question. This is a huge question, but I think between me and you, we can do it.
All right.
Why do we think that the world isn't ready to recognize certain things that are very plainly true? What's standing in the way? It's such a big question, but I want to ask that. It's like you're the Buddha here. I'm asking that.
In a way, it's kind of like the Anosognosia conversation we were having a few minutes ago, which is that Anne Dunning-Kruger, those two things figure into this, right? They don't want to experience cognitive dissonance. They don't want to believe they don't understand things. So our brain is so resistant to change. It just is. Because when you change, it's, our body fights change of the self the way it fights change in our very body itself. Like if we were, somebody trying to tear our arm off, our brain reacts similarly when somebody tries to change our self functions. We just resist.
Oh yeah, right.
Yeah. And I think some of it's in there somehow, and to sort of have to adjust their priorities and their motivation and their thoughts about other people in the world and how they fit into it. It's not easy for people.
It isn't. Let me throw out another part, though, that I think is a key factor, and it's that I think, I not only think, but I know this to be true from a psychological standpoint. We're all the little kids that we once were.
Yeah.
And I think there is a fantasy that if we keep wishing for something to be a certain way, that it will be that way.
Maybe.
But I think that it's better if we can to commit to not seeing things as we wish them to be.
Right. There's and there's probably a reason we don't see them. We don't like it. We whatever it is we're not wanting to see the way it really is, there's some reason there.
I think that's true, but I also find that when people see the true reason, they actually don't hate it as much as they think. In a lot of ways, it's freeing.
Yeah, it's always better. However, I will tell you that, I experienced what I think Melanie Klein used to call the depressive position.
Yes.
Which is when you start to change, there's a grief reaction with that.
Oh,
your old self, your old world goes away, and a new one emerges. Better, feels good, but there is grief, and humans fucking fight against grief like nothing else. And I think that might be one of the reasons that they resist.
I think you're so right on. As I think about it, that makes a lot of sense. People just they're afraid of that. I actually think also they're afraid of feeling powerful in themselves and feeling that they can make their own decisions. And I think I know some of why. But I think some of it is that they know that if they accept the fullness of reality, one of the things we have to accept is that we're alone.
Right. We're alone and we're going to die. And mommy and daddy aren't going to save things.
Right.
And that's, again, grief.
Grief. Very well said. Well, let's finish up on this. You've had an impact on so many people. I'm sure more than you would even know, because there's just people out there reading things that you write or hearing things that you say. What would you still like to change in the world?
Well, I'd
since
like
that's what we're really after.
The post-structural stuff. You took aim at. I'm with you on that one. Well, I mean, I want to change the homeless thing because I know exactly how to do it. Those are my patients all over the street. It drives me crazy because I know exactly what can be done for those people. And instead, they're dying by the thousands. I can't live with that.
That's very hard.
In terms of changing, you're sort of talking about changing the kind of landscape.
I tend to be,
or psychologically?
I tend to be a big thinker. So, like my feeling is one of the things I would like to change is the notion of truth. I want to push back really hard against that in a productive, positive, and accepted way, a way that doesn't wreck things.
Yeah, my version of that would be, let's give some good science training to high school age students, like real science training. So they're not just thinking science is a story or a narrative arc. Actually expose them to science, how it works. They're up for it, trust me.
Yeah, no, I think they would be. And that's, I think people underestimate how much people do actually want the truth.
Well, how much they can tolerate too, and we can do a lot more than we're doing right now. And we should be asking more of students particularly, because it will help them. They'll love it. But it's hard. It's hard.
It is, but I agree with you. I think that if we underestimate what people are capable of, or if we underestimate what our brains are capable of, or if we underestimate what other people are capable of, we lose so much.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know. I'd have to sit and think for a while about what big changes. I have so many.
Well, I did put you on the spot, so you can.
Yeah.
You do not have to answer that question, but what I would like is let's keep in touch, and you can. I just want to continue these discussions because I think when two people or multiple people get together and they're committed to new ways of understanding and they're challenging certain assumptions, we can address huge problems like the opioid epidemic or homelessness or the speed at which therapy can happen.
That I'd like to see happen, that people open themselves to dialectic. That's how we improve and refine our knowledge base.
I think that's the key. Well, I wanted to thank you for taking such time with me. It's an honor.
Pleasure.
And getting to hear how your mind works, I can see how far you've gotten in your life through the curiosity about things, the openness about things, and you synthesize information really well and can communicate it so well. So
very kind.
You're making a big difference in the world, and I appreciate you coming on here and sharing some time with my audience and me.
Pleasure.
And thanks again.
Pleasure to see you again. Let's go do more.
That sounds good. Great to see you, Dr. Drew.
All right, see you then.
Okay. Well, it was a real honor to connect with Dr. Drew, and I have to say, the more I get to know him, the more I really am blown away by the variety of things that he knows and the depth to which he knows these things, and his compassion and caring for other people. Whether we're talking about homelessness, or whether we're talking about chronic pain, or sex, or how to open up conversations, or even just being open to ideas, he's always about opening the conversation, and I'm so pleased to have spent this time with him. If you haven't already, click subscribe, ring the bell for notifications, hit like if you like what you're hearing, and put your comments below and we'll get back to you personally.